German POWs expected America to be weak. What they saw shocked them. In the turbulent spring and summer of 1944, as the Allied armies surged forward across Europe, from the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy to the crumbling defenses in Italy and the relentless advance in North Africa, the tide of war turned decisively against Nazi Germany. Thousands upon thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers, once the proud conquerors of Europe, now found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and forced to surrender in ever-increasing numbers. These men, hardened veterans of the Blitzkrieg campaigns through Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, young recruits filled with ideological fervor from the Hitler Youth, and seasoned officers steeped in the traditions of Prussian military excellence, were disarmed, searched, and herded into temporary holding areas along the front lines. From there, many were loaded onto massive troop ships and converted Liberty vessels for a long journey across the Atlantic Ocean to a destination few had ever seriously contemplated: prisoner of war camps scattered deep inside the vast interior of the United States of America. To these German prisoners, the news of their transfer to America came with a strange mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and outright contempt. For years, the Nazi propaganda machine under Dr. Joseph Goebbels had relentlessly portrayed the United States as a decaying, decadent superpower teetering on the edge of collapse. Daily radio broadcasts, weekly newsreels in cinemas, posters on every street corner, and articles in newspapers like the Völkischer Beobachter hammered home the same relentless messages. America was a nation deeply divided by racial strife and class warfare, still crippled by the lingering effects of the Great Depression, overrun by gangsters, corrupt Jewish financiers, and Bolshevik agitators, and populated by soft, materialistic citizens who prized comfort over duty and were utterly unwilling to endure real hardship for any cause. German soldiers were repeatedly told that American factories were plagued by constant strikes and sabotage, that severe food shortages were rampant across the country, that major cities were overcrowded slums with breadlines stretching for blocks, that unemployment was skyrocketing again, and that the average American, spoiled by Hollywood luxuries, jazz music, and consumer goods, lacked the iron discipline, racial purity, and warrior spirit necessary for prolonged total war. Many POWs openly scoffed at Allied propaganda leaflets dropped over the front lines, showing smiling GIs with plenty of food, cigarettes, and modern equipment. They believed it was all blatant lies, exaggerated photographic trickery designed solely to demoralize German troops and encourage desertion. Officers in particular clung tightly to these beliefs. Influenced directly by Adolf Hitler's own rants in Mein Kampf and his numerous speeches declaring America a half-Judaized, half-negrified mongrel nation without true cultural or racial unity, they viewed the U.S. military as an awkward coalition reliant on overwhelming numbers and mechanical gadgets rather than individual bravery or tactical genius. The Americans fight with machines because they lack the soul of the true soldier. One captured colonel from the Panzer Lehr Division reportedly told his American interrogators shortly after Normandy. Another common refrain among the officer class was that once the initial novelty of combat wore off and the realities of attrition set in, American troops would break psychologically and run, unable to stomach the kind of fanatical, sacrificial fighting that German soldiers routinely demonstrated on the Eastern Front against the Red Army. So when these prisoners, eventually numbering over 400,000 at the peak in 1945, learned they were bound for permanent camps scattered across 46 American states, from the scorching deserts of Arizona and New Mexico to the dense forests of Maine and Michigan, from the cotton fields of the Deep South to the snowy mountains of Colorado and the fertile plains of the Midwest, many expected to see firsthand confirmation of everything Goebbels and the Nazi regime had preached for years. They imagined arriving in a war-weary, exhausted nation, mandatory blackouts in every major city to conserve energy, massive craters from imagined U-boat artillery attacks on coastal areas, factories standing idle due to chronic labor shortages and raw material scarcity, farms struggling with poor harvests and soil depletion, long ration lines for even basic staples like bread and potatoes, and a civilian population increasingly resentful of the endless war and the sacrifices demanded by faraway leaders in Washington. Instead, they encountered a reality that left them utterly speechless, profoundly shaken, and, for many, quietly convinced that the war was irretrievably lost long before the final battles. The transatlantic journey itself began to chip away at their preconceptions. Aboard the crowded but remarkably well-provisioned ships, often the same Liberty vessels that had carried American troops to Europe, the POWs received 3 regular meals a day, often better in quality and quantity than what German civilians were receiving back home under constant Allied bombing raids. Hot coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz chicory substitute, fresh bread, canned meat, vegetables, and even occasional desserts or chocolate bars from Red Cross parcels. Cigarettes were distributed regularly. American brands like Lucky Strike or Camel, the German soldiers had only heard about in rumors. For men who had spent months or years on short rations at the front, this alone was a revelation. But the real shock began when the ships finally docked at major American ports like New York, Boston, Norfolk, or Charleston, and the prisoners were loaded onto long trains for the journey inland. As the trains pulled away from the bustling coastal cities gleaming with electric lights at night, bustling with civilian traffic during the day, completely untouched by the devastating air raids that had reduced Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, and dozens of other German cities to smoking rubble. The Germans pressed their faces to the windows in stunned disbelief. No mandatory blackouts, no massive bomb craters scarring the landscape, skyscrapers standing tall and proud, streets filled with private automobiles, in numbers far exceeding anything seen in pre-war Germany. People on the sidewalks well-dressed, well-fed, and appearing energetic rather than weary. But it was the journey westward, deep into the American heartland, that truly shattered their worldview once and for all. Crossing the Appalachian Mountains and entering the vast expanse of the Great Plains in the Midwest, the landscape unfolded like something from an impossible dream, or, for loyal Nazis, a propaganda nightmare. Endless horizons of incredibly fertile farmland, fields of golden wheat, corn, and soybeans stretching as far as the eye could see, larger than entire German provinces combined. The soil was black and rich, the crops healthy and abundant. Modern tractors, combines, and other agricultural machinery worked the land with ruthless efficiency, machinery that made German horse-drawn plows and manual labor look positively primitive by comparison. Massive grain silos rose like industrial skyscrapers dotted across the countryside, rivers wide, calm, and navigable, crossed by sturdy bridges and lined with barges carrying goods. Small towns passed by with clean, tree-lined streets, white picket fences, modern schools, churches, and grocery stores displaying goods in their windows, goods that had completely vanished from German shops years earlier due to bombing and blockades. One captured sergeant from the Afrika Korps, who had fought Rommel's campaigns in the desert before being taken prisoner in Tunisia, later described the scene in a post-war memoir. We traveled through states called Illinois, Iowa, and Kansas. The fields were immense, the soil darker and richer than anything in Bavaria or Prussia. Farmers waved from enormous machines that harvested more grain in a single day than our entire village, collectives managed in a week. There were no ruins, no refugees crowding the roads, no signs of hunger or deprivation in the faces of the people we saw from the train. I turned to my comrade and whispered, "This is not the America they described to us in the newsreels." When the trains finally arrived at the designated POW camps, over 500 facilities in total across the country, places like Camp Trinidad in Colorado, Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Aliceville in Alabama, Camp Concordia in Kansas, or the sprawling complexes in Wisconsin, Michigan, and California, the astonishment only intensified. The camps themselves were modern, clean, and remarkably humane, far exceeding the minimum requirements of the Geneva Convention, which Germany had often ignored in its treatment of Soviet prisoners. But the true, mind-altering revelation came when thousands of enlisted POWs volunteered for paid labor details outside the wire. To help alleviate wartime manpower shortages in agriculture and industry, The U.S. government established programs allowing non-officer prisoners to work on nearby farms, in food processing plants, lumber mills, canneries, and even some light manufacturing, all under careful supervision and with wages deposited into accounts payable upon repatriation. Tens of thousands took advantage of the opportunity, both for the pay and the chance to escape camp monotony. On the great farms of the Midwest and South, German prisoners harvested wheat, corn, cotton, and sugar beets in quantities that seemed impossible. They operated advanced American machinery, saw vast irrigation systems turning semi-arid land into productive fields, and witnessed crop yields that single-handedly fed not just the United States, but much of the Allied war effort worldwide. American farmers, often short-handed with their own sons away at war, frequently shared midday or evening meals with the POW work crews, tables laden with roast beef, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables from the garden, cornbread, apple pie, and cold milk straight from the dairy. For men who had subsisted on watery soup and black bread for years, these meals were a revelation. In the industrial North and West, POWs assigned to canneries and food processing plants watched assembly lines running around the clock, packaging millions of tons of food for shipment overseas. But the most awe-inspiring sights were reserved for organized tours to iconic wartime production facilities. Many groups of prisoners were taken to see Henry Ford's colossal Willow Run bomber plant near Detroit, Michigan, the largest single factory under one roof in the world, where B-24 Liberator heavy bombers rolled off the assembly line at the astonishing rate of one complete aircraft every 63 minutes at peak production. Standing on elevated observation platforms, the Germans watched in silent amazement as thousands of American workers, men and women of all ages, white and black, immigrants and native-born, coordinated with machine-like precision to build 4-engine bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down over Europe. A captured U-boat officer who toured Willow Run later recalled in his memoirs, "I stood there for hours, counting the planes coming out, one bomber every hour. I knew in that moment that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost forever. No submarine fleet, no matter how brave, could sink ships fast enough to match this." Similar stories emerged from visits to shipyards along the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf coasts. German naval prisoners saw Kaiser shipyards in California and Oregon launching Liberty ships and Victory ships, standardized, mass-produced cargo vessels, at rates of 3 or 4 per day from a single facility. The United States was building more merchant tonnage in a single month than the entire German shipbuilding industry had managed in years, despite constant Allied bombing. The statistics were staggering, and many POWs heard them repeated by their American guards or in camp newspapers. By 1944, America was producing more steel than Germany and Japan combined, more aircraft than all Axis powers together, more trucks than the rest of the world, more synthetic rubber, more oil, more aluminum, all while maintaining the highest standard of living of any nation at war. Butter, sugar, gasoline, and clothing were rationed, yes, but still available in quantities that German civilians could only dream of under the Allied blockade and bombing campaign. As the months turned into years inside the camps, something profound began to happen to many of the prisoners. The constant exposure to American abundance slowly eroded the ideological certainties they had carried with them into captivity. Hardline Nazi officers who had once lectured their men about the superiority of National Socialism and the inevitability of German victory now fell silent or withdrew into themselves. Some began secretly reading American newspapers and magazines smuggled into the camps. Others attended voluntary re-education classes offered by the U.S. Army's Special Projects Division, classes that showed newsreels of liberated concentration camps explained democratic principles, and exposed the full extent of Nazi atrocities, footage that many ordinary soldiers claimed they had never seen or believed before. A recurring question began to circulate quietly among the officer prisoners, one that reportedly reached even high-ranking generals held in special camps. How can we possibly defeat a country like this? The arithmetic was merciless and inescapable. One single American factory complex could produce more war material in a week than entire German industries managed in a month under constant bombardment and resource starvation. By early 1945, as news of the Red Army's advance into Germany, the fall of the Philippines, and the firebombing of Japanese cities filtered into the camps via radio broadcasts and newspapers, this question turned into quiet resignation and despair. Many POWs admitted privately to each other, and some even openly to their American guards, that the moment they saw America's industrial heartland and agricultural bounty with their own eyes, they understood the war had been lost long ago. The courage of German soldiers on the battlefield, no matter how fanatical, could never overcome such overwhelming material superiority. When the war finally ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender, over 400,000 German POWs remained in American custody. Most were gradually repatriated between 1946 and 1948, often to a Germany devastated beyond recognition, major cities flattened into moonscapes of rubble, millions homeless and starving, infrastructure destroyed, food supplies critically short under the harsh winter of 1946 to 47. The stark contrast with what they had experienced in America was overwhelming, and for some, life-changing. Many former POWs spoke openly about their time in the United States in the decades after the war. Some published memoirs recounting their astonishment. A few even emigrated legally back to the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, seeking the prosperity and opportunity they had witnessed firsthand during captivity. Others, in interviews with historians, admitted that their time as prisoners in America had been the pivotal moment when their faith in Nazi victory died completely. The lesson was clear and enduring. America's victory in World War II was not just the result of brave soldiers on distant battlefields, though their courage was unquestionable. It was the product of an unstoppable industrial and agricultural machine, backed by vast natural resources, innovative mass production techniques, and a society capable of mobilizing its entire economy without collapsing into ruin. So let me ask you the question that still echoes from those American prison camps nearly 80 years later. Did America win World War II primarily because of the unmatched courage and sacrifice of its soldiers on the front lines, or because of its overwhelming industrial power and the sheer abundance of resources that made total victory inevitable? Comment soldiers if you believe it was the men in uniform who made the difference. Comment industry if you think America's factories, farms, and assembly lines were the true decisive weapon. Or comment both, because perhaps it took the perfect combination of both to defeat the most dangerous enemy the free world has ever faced. Like this video, if these forgotten stories of American strength and resilience inspire you, subscribe and turn on notifications for more untold moments that shocked the Axis powers, and I'll see you in the next one.